A black cleaning lady found out about an attempt on a millionaire's life and decided to warn him, risking everything. Don't forget to subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching us from. Emily Williams rose early every morning before the sun broke the horizon, her tiny apartment barely lit by the faint glow of the city lights. The sounds of New York were already alive outside her window. Cars honking, garbage trucks rumbling down the street, the distant murmur of people starting their day. She moved through her routine methodically, pulling on her uniform and tying her hair back into a neat bun. She had long since learned that blending in was the easiest way to survive. Her commute to the hotel where she worked was another daily reminder of her position in the city's intricate social hierarchy. The subway car was crowded and humid despite the early hour, filled with faces either glued to their phones or staring blankly ahead. No one acknowledged her, and she didn't expect them to. When she finally emerged into the crisp morning air near Midtown, the towering skyscrapers around her seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky, symbols of wealth and power she would never touch. By the time Emily arrived at the hotel, the day was already in full swing. The staff entrance was a narrow, unassuming door hidden from the grandeur of the main entrance where valets and doormen greeted wealthy guests. Inside, the air was tinged with the faint smell of cleaning supplies and freshly laundered linens. Emily clocked in without a word, joining a handful of other housekeeping staff as they prepared for the day ahead. Her first assignment was on the upper floors, where the most luxurious suites were located. The hallway was eerily quiet, with thick carpets muffling every footstep. Emily pushed her cart down the corridor, her eyes on the patterned walls and gold-accented light fixtures. She passed guests occasionally, their perfectly pressed suits and designer dresses a stark contrast to her simple uniform. Most of them didn't even glance at her, and those who did offered only cold, dismissive stares. Her first task of the day was Suite 1705. It was one of the hotel's grandest rooms, reserved for only the wealthiest clientele. As she entered, she paused for a moment, taking in the aftermath of what appeared to have been a wild party the night before. Empty champagne bottles littered the counters, lipstick-stained glasses were scattered across the room, and a pair of expensive heels lay abandoned near the couch. Emily sighed and got to work. She started with the trash, carefully collecting the bottles and leftover food. Then came the surfaces, wiping away fingerprints and stains as she worked her way from one corner of the room to the next. She knew every inch of this room like the back of her hand. Its opulence never failed to remind her of the vast chasm between her life and the lives of those who stayed here. As she moved to the bedroom, she noticed a faint smear of makeup on the pristine white sheets. It wasn't uncommon for guests to leave traces of their nights behind, and it was her job to erase them. She stripped the bed and replaced the linens, her motions efficient and practiced. The scent of the freshly laundered sheets momentarily masked the faint perfume that lingered in the air, a reminder of the guest who had stayed here. Emily worked quickly, knowing she had several more rooms to clean before the day was over. By the time she finished, her arms ached, and a thin sheen of sweat covered her forehead. She wiped her brow with the back of her hand and pushed her cart back into the hallway. Another guest passed her, their gaze sliding over her as if she were invisible. It was the same every day. Guests treated her like part of the furniture, blending into the background as if she didn't exist. Even her co-workers, many of whom were from similar backgrounds, had their own ways of keeping their heads down and avoiding attention. Emily had learned to do the same. It was easier that way. Her thoughts were interrupted when her supervisor approached her. Mr. Hargrove was a middle-aged white man with a perpetually sour expression. He carried a clipboard and rarely looked up from it when speaking to her. "Suite 1903 needs a quick turnover," he said brusquely. "Some VIPs are checking in this afternoon. Make sure it's spotless." Emily nodded silently, knowing better than to argue. She pushed her cart to the elevator and rode it up to the 19th floor, her mind already shifting to the next task. Suite 1903 was one of the most exclusive rooms in the hotel, often reserved for celebrities and high-profile guests. The thought of being in such close proximity to wealth and power always left her with a mix of awe and resentment. As she worked, Emily couldn't help but think about her father. He had been a janitor for most of his life, working long hours to provide for their family. He had always told her to hold her head high, no matter how people treated her. "They don't define you, Emily," he would say. "Your worth isn't in their hands." But it was hard to remember those words when she was scrubbing toilets or picking up after people who saw her as less than human. Her father's death had left a hole in her life, one that no amount of hard work could fill. She often wondered what he would think if he could see her now, following in his footsteps in a job that demanded everything and gave so little in return. By the end of her shift, Emily was exhausted. She returned her cart to the supply room and clocked out, the weight of the day settling on her shoulders. As she walked through the bustling streets back to her apartment, she felt the familiar pang of frustration and longing. She wanted more for herself, but the path forward felt insurmountable. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling of her apartment, Emily thought about the guests she had encountered that day. People like Amanda Wilson, who seemed to embody everything she despised about the world she served. Amanda was the epitome of privilege, wealthy, white, and untouchable. She treated people like Emily as though they were beneath her, unworthy of even a passing glance. Emily's thoughts drifted to the upcoming anniversary of her father's death. It had been years since he passed, but the pain still lingered. She resolved to visit his grave soon, even if it meant asking for time off, a request she knew would be met with disdain. But she owed it to him. He had always believed in her, even when she struggled to believe in herself. As she drifted off to sleep, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that her life was on the verge of change. She didn't know how or when, but something in her gut told her that the invisible life she had been leading was about to collide with a world that had always ignored her. The next day began like any other for Emily. She rose before dawn, the chill of the early morning air seeping into her small apartment. Her routine was mechanical: shower, dress, scarf down a piece of toast, and head to work. The predictability was both comforting and stifling. She often thought about how her life had become an endless loop of thankless tasks, but she rarely dwelled on it for long. Survival required focus, and focus didn't leave room for complaints. Arriving at the hotel, she clocked in and took her cart to the elevator. Her first assignment of the day was Suite 1703, another one of the grand accommodations reserved for the wealthiest guests. The hallways on the upper floors were immaculate, the kind of luxury that felt almost otherworldly to someone like Emily. She pushed her cart slowly, savoring the few moments of quiet before the day's chaos began. When she reached the suite, she hesitated briefly, her hand on the door handle. The "Do Not Disturb" sign was gone, which meant the room was ready to be cleaned. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, her eyes immediately scanning the space. It was a mess: empty champagne bottles on the counter, a half-eaten room service tray on the coffee table, and clothes strewn across the floor. Emily sighed and began her work. She started with the trash, picking up the bottles and carefully placing them in the bin on her cart. The clink of glass echoed in the otherwise silent room. Next, she moved to the coffee table, wiping away crumbs and stains with a practiced efficiency. Her movements were automatic, her mind wandering as she worked. When she reached the bedroom, she noticed a faint smear of makeup on the pillowcase. The guest clearly hadn't cared to remove it before collapsing into bed the night before. Emily stripped the bed, bundling the soiled linens into a tight ball before replacing them with fresh sheets. She fluffed the pillows and smoothed the comforter, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. As she worked, she heard faint voices coming from the adjoining room. She paused, her hand still on the pillow she had just adjusted. It wasn't uncommon to hear guests talking or arguing through the thin walls, but something about the tone of these voices caught her attention. They were hushed, sharp, almost conspiratorial. Emily moved closer to the door that separated the bedroom from the next room. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the words were impossible to ignore. "You're sure he'll take the bait?" a woman's voice asked. It was familiar, smooth and clipped with a hint of disdain. Emily recognized it immediately as Amanda Wilson's. "Of course," a man replied. His voice was lower, colder. "James is too trusting. He won't see it coming." Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. They were talking about James Wilson, Amanda's husband. She leaned closer to the door, straining to hear more. "We'll make sure the trip is his last," Amanda continued. "Once he's out of the picture, everything will fall into place." The blood drained from Emily's face. They were planning something terrible. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she was hearing. Amanda's words were filled with venom, and the man, whom Emily assumed was her lover, spoke with an unsettling calmness. "You'd better not screw this up," Amanda said, her voice sharper now. "One mistake, and everything we've worked for is gone." "I know what's at stake," the man replied, "but you need to keep your cool. We can't afford any loose ends." Loose ends. The words sent a chill down Emily's spine. She backed away from the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to pretend she hadn't heard anything, but her feet wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her mind replaying the conversation over and over again. They were planning to kill James. There was no other way to interpret what she had heard. Amanda and this man, whoever he was, were plotting to get rid of him, and they were confident, too confident, that their plan would succeed. Emily's pulse quickened as she considered her options. She could walk away, keep her head down, and continue her invisible life. No one would ever know she had overheard the conversation. It would be safer that way. But could she live with herself if she did nothing? Could she let an innocent man walk into a trap, knowing she might have been able to stop it? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a chair scraping against the floor in the next room. The voices grew fainter, and she realized they were leaving. She moved quickly, finishing the bed and wiping down the nightstand before hurrying out of the suite. Her hands trembled as she pushed her cart back into the hallway, her mind a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty. For the rest of the day, Emily went through the motions of her work, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about Amanda's words, about the cold, calculated way she and her lover had discussed James's demise. The image of his face flashed in her mind. Handsome, serious, and always surrounded by a flurry of activity. He was someone she had seen from a distance many times, but never up close. That evening, As she sat alone in her apartment, Emily replayed the conversation in her mind. She knew she had to do something, but the thought of approaching James terrified her. What if he didn't believe her? What if Amanda found out she had interfered? The risk was enormous, but so was the cost of doing nothing. Emily clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. She couldn't let fear control her. Amanda and her lover were playing a dangerous game, and James was their pawn. Whether he believed her or not, she had to try. She couldn't let them win. Emily barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, Amanda's chilling words echoed in her mind. "We'll make sure the trip is his last." The weight of what she had overheard pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket, her thoughts spiraling with fear and doubt. By the time the sun rose, she had already made her decision. She couldn't stay silent. She had to warn James Wilson. But how? She was just a maid, invisible to people like him. He might not even remember her face. Would he even listen? And if he did, would he believe her? The risk of approaching him felt overwhelming. Amanda was dangerous. Emily could feel it in every word the woman spoke. If she found out someone had interfered, Emily's own safety could be at risk. Still, as she stared at her reflection in the small bathroom mirror, she knew she couldn't ignore this. If something happened to James and she had done nothing, she would never forgive herself. Her father had always taught her to stand up for what was right, even when it felt impossible. "Do the right thing, even if no one thanks you for it," he used to say. The memory of his voice strengthened her resolve. That morning, she arrived at work with her heart pounding in her chest. She avoided her co-workers and supervisor, knowing that her anxiety would show if anyone looked too closely. She focused on her tasks, biding her time until she could find an opportunity to approach James. The chance came late in the afternoon. Emily was in the lobby, cleaning the base of one of the grand marble columns near the entrance. The air was filled with the hum of voices, the clicking of high heels on polished floors, and the occasional ringing of a phone at the front desk. Out of the corner of her eye, she spotted James stepping out of an elevator, flanked by two assistants. He was taller in person than she had expected, his sharp suit tailored to perfection. He moved with an air of authority, his expression focused as he glanced at the screen of his phone. Emily's nerves surged. This was her moment, but her hands trembled as she set down her cleaning cloth. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. She had to do this. Pushing through her fear, she stepped into his path. "Mr. Wilson," she said, her voice trembling slightly. James stopped abruptly, his assistants pausing beside him. His eyes flicked to her name tag before landing on her face. For a moment, he said nothing, his expression unreadable. "Yes?" he asked, his tone polite but brisk, as if he didn't have time for interruptions. Emily felt her palms grow damp, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I need to speak with you. It's important." One of his assistants, a young man with slicked-back hair, frowned and stepped forward. "Mr. Wilson has a meeting. If this is about housekeeping—" "It's not," Emily interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "It's about your safety." James raised a hand, silencing his assistant. "What do you mean, my safety?" he asked, his tone sharp now, his attention fully on her. Emily glanced around the busy lobby, her pulse racing. "Not here," she said quietly. "Please, just a few minutes. Somewhere private." James hesitated, his brows furrowing as he studied her. She could see the doubt in his eyes, the skepticism, but after a moment he nodded. "Fine. My office." He motioned for her to follow him, and she did, feeling the eyes of his assistants boring into her back. They stepped into the elevator, the silence inside thick with tension. Emily kept her gaze down, her heart hammering in her chest. This was her one shot. She couldn't mess it up. When they reached his office, a sleek, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, James gestured for her to sit. Emily perched on the edge of a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "All right," James said, leaning against his desk with his arms crossed. "You've got my attention. What's this about?" Emily took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. She told him everything about cleaning the suite, overhearing Amanda and the man she was with, and their plan to kill him during his upcoming trip. She recounted their exact words, leaving nothing out. When she finished, the room was silent. James's expression was unreadable, but his eyes were locked on hers. She couldn't tell if he believed her or thought she was out of her mind. Finally, he spoke. "You're asking me to believe that my wife is plotting to kill me, based on what you overheard." Emily's heart sank at the doubt in his voice. She had expected this, but it still stung. "I know how it sounds," she said quickly, "but I wouldn't come to you if I wasn't sure. Please, just think about it. If you go on that trip—" Her voice trailed off, the implication hanging heavy in the air. James straightened, his expression hardening. "I'll think about what you've said," he said curtly. "You can go." Emily hesitated, wanting to say more, but the look in his eyes made it clear the conversation was over. She nodded and stood, her legs shaky as she left his office. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Emily threw herself into her work, trying to push the encounter out of her mind. She had done what she could. Whether James believed her or not was out of her control. But as the hours dragged on, doubt began to creep in. Had she made a mistake? Was it enough? That evening, as she left the hotel, she saw James in the lobby, surrounded by his assistants. He caught her eye for a brief moment before turning back to his conversation. Emily felt a pang of uncertainty, but she reminded herself that she had done her part. She had warned him. The rest was up to him. The following morning, news spread quickly among the staff that James had canceled his trip. No explanation was given, but Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. He had listened. He might not have believed her fully, but he had taken her warning seriously enough to act on it. But her relief was short-lived. Later that day, she noticed Amanda watching her from across the lobby. Her expression was cold, her eyes narrowing as Emily passed by with her cart. A chill ran down Emily's spine. Amanda didn't know what she had done, or at least she hoped not, but something in the woman's gaze made her stomach churn. Emily returned to her duties, but the unease lingered. She had taken a step into a dangerous world, one where people like Amanda played by their own ruthless rules. And now, she was part of the game. The days following James's canceled trip were a strange blur for Emily. The hotel seemed to carry an undercurrent of tension, subtle but undeniable. Staff whispered in hushed tones about the sudden change in the billionaire's schedule, while Amanda's mood darkened visibly. Emily kept her head down, avoiding Amanda at all costs, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every glance from a co-worker felt like a question, every shadow in the hall like a warning. She had acted to save James's life, but in doing so, she had stepped into a storm she couldn't yet comprehend. James, meanwhile, had taken her warning to heart. Though he hadn't explicitly told Emily he believed her, the evidence of his caution was everywhere. He was quieter, more observant, and for the first time in years he began questioning the trust he had placed in those closest to him. He had seen cracks in Amanda's polished exterior before, moments of uncharacteristic cruelty or sharp anger, but he had dismissed them as fleeting. Now, her every word, her every move, seemed like a part of a larger puzzle he was only beginning to piece together. Determined to uncover the truth, James hired a private investigator. The man was thorough, methodical, and discreet, digging into every aspect of Amanda's life and relationships. What he found was worse than James could have imagined. Amanda had been siphoning money from their shared accounts for years, funneling it into offshore holdings under false names. But financial fraud was just the surface. The investigator also uncovered connections between Amanda and a series of mysterious deaths. Employees, business associates, even an old friend of James's father, people who had gotten in her way. One of those deaths caught James's attention more than the others. Thomas Williams, a former employee of the Wilson Families Corporation. He had died in what had been reported as a car accident nearly 2 decades ago. The investigators' notes suggested otherwise. Thomas had been a whistleblower, poised to expose corruption within the company that Amanda's father had led at the time. His death had been suspiciously timed, coming just days before he was scheduled to meet with federal regulators. James stared at the report, his stomach twisting. He remembered Thomas vaguely, a diligent, hard-working man who had always been kind to him as a boy. The name stirred something deeper, a memory he couldn't quite place. He flipped through the file, his eyes scanning the details until a photograph slipped from between the pages. It was a picture of Thomas and his young daughter, smiling proudly in front of a modest home. The girl looked familiar. Too familiar. It was Emily. James's breath caught. He stared at the photo, the realization settling over him like a heavy weight. Emily, the maid who had risked everything to warn him, was the daughter of the man whose death had been orchestrated by Amanda's family. The connection was too profound to ignore. This wasn't just about saving his life. It was about justice for Emily, for her father, and for everyone Amanda had wronged. Emily's life at the hotel continued as usual, at least on the surface. She followed her daily routine, scrubbing, dusting, and vacuuming, while trying to remain invisible. But inside, she was anything but calm. Amanda's lingering glances, the whispers among the staff, and the heavy burden of what she had overheard left her on edge. She didn't regret warning James, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her actions had put her in Amanda's crosshairs. That unease deepened one evening when she returned to her apartment. As she unlocked the door, she noticed a plain envelope slipped beneath the threshold. Her name was written on it in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. When she opened it, her heart stopped. "Your father knew too much. So do you. Be careful." Emily stared at the note, her chest tightening with fear. The words were a warning, or a threat. She didn't need to guess who had sent it. Amanda must have figured out that Emily was the one who had warned James. She tried to steady her breathing, but her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Amanda had already shown she was capable of murder. What would stop her from targeting Emily? Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her spiraling thoughts. The screen showed an unknown number. She hesitated but answered, her voice shaky. "Hello? Emily?" It was James. His tone was urgent, but there was an undertone of something softer. "We need to talk. I've learned something you need to know. Can you meet me at the cafe on Lexington? Tonight?" Emily's fear mingled with confusion. Why was James calling her? What had he discovered? Yes, I can come, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The cafe was quiet, a small place tucked between office buildings that catered to late-night patrons. Emily entered hesitantly, spotting James at a corner table. He rose as she approached, gesturing for her to sit. His usual air of polished control was replaced with something rawer, concern, maybe even guilt. Once she was seated, he wasted no time. "Emily, I need to tell you something about your father." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her father. She hadn't expected this. Her mind reeled as James explained everything: the investigators' findings, the connection to Amanda, the orchestrated death that had been disguised as an accident. He showed her the photo, the one of her and her father, and she felt a lump rise in her throat. Her father's death had always felt like an unresolved wound, a tragedy she had never fully understood. Now, hearing that it had been a deliberate act of malice, Emily felt a surge of emotions: grief, anger, and a burning desire for justice. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. She had cried enough for her father. Now, she had to act. "I don't know how to make this right," James said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "But I promise you, Amanda will answer for what she's done. For your father. For everything." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. She wasn't just a bystander in this anymore. This fight wasn't just about protecting James. It was personal. Amanda had taken her father from her, and now she was trying to take even more. Emily wouldn't let her. That night, Emily returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. The note she had received was still in her pocket, its warning echoing in her mind. Amanda thought she could silence her, just as she had silenced her father. But Emily wasn't the same scared little girl who had watched her world fall apart. She was stronger now, smarter, and she wasn't going to back down. She sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the note and the photograph of her father that James had given her. The words her father had always said to her came rushing back: "Do the right thing, even if no one thanks you for it." Emily clenched her fist, the photo crumpling slightly in her hand. She had spent years being invisible, blending into the background, letting the world walk over her. But not anymore. Amanda had taken too much. It was time to take something back. The next morning, Emily woke with a new sense of determination. The fear that had gripped her for days was still there, but it was tempered by a fierce resolve. Amanda Wilson had stolen too much from her father, from her family's future, and now she was trying to steal her peace of mind. Emily wouldn't let her. The time for hiding was over. At work, the tension in the air had grown even thicker. Amanda's behavior had become increasingly erratic, snapping at staff, issuing contradictory orders, and spending long hours in her suite with the door firmly locked. Emily kept her distance, but she couldn't help noticing the subtle signs of a woman who felt her control slipping. Amanda was unraveling, and it only made her more dangerous. James contacted Emily that afternoon. He had learned of a potential breakthrough. Amanda's family owned a sprawling estate upstate, a property that had been largely abandoned for years. According to the investigator's report, Amanda still used it to store sensitive documents, records that detailed her financial crimes, her connections to various underhanded dealings, and possibly even evidence tying her to the deaths of her enemies. If they could get their hands on those files, it would be the end of Amanda's reign of terror. The estate, however, was far from unguarded. Though it appeared abandoned to the casual observer, James's investigator had uncovered signs of a sophisticated security system and periodic visits by private contractors hired to maintain the property. It wouldn't be easy to infiltrate, but it was their best chance. That evening, Emily and James met at his apartment to plan the operation. The space was immaculate, every surface gleaming under the soft glow of designer lighting. Emily felt out of place, but James quickly put her at ease. He treated her as an equal, not just a maid who had stumbled into his life, but as a partner in their shared mission. "We'll need to act quickly," James said, spreading a map of the estate across his coffee table. The property was vast, surrounded by dense woods and a tall wrought iron fence. Amanda could decide to move those files at any time. Emily studied the map, her mind racing. The main house was set far back from the road, accessible only by a long, winding driveway. The investigator had marked potential weak points in the fence, areas where they could slip in undetected. The real challenge, however, would be bypassing the security system and locating the hidden safe inside the house. "Do you think the files will still be there?" Emily asked, her voice steady despite the knot of anxiety in her chest. "They should be," James replied. "Amanda's arrogance is one of her greatest weaknesses. She thinks she's untouchable, that no one would dare come after her. That's what we're counting on." They spent hours refining their plan. James would handle the security system. His investigator had provided detailed schematics and codes that would disable the cameras and alarms temporarily. Emily's role was equally critical. Once inside, her sharp eye for detail and experience with cleaning would help them navigate the house without leaving a trace. Despite the careful preparation, Emily couldn't ignore the risks. If Amanda found out what they were planning, she wouldn't hesitate to retaliate. The note Emily had received was proof enough of that. But as she looked at James, his determination matching her own, she felt a spark of hope. They were in this together, and together they might just succeed. The night of the operation arrived quickly. James picked Emily up in an unassuming sedan, his usual polished demeanor replaced by quiet focus. The drive to the estate was tense, the darkened highway stretching endlessly before them. Emily stared out the window, her thoughts swirling. She thought of her father, of the life he had tried to give her, and of the justice she had longed for since the day he died. This was her chance to make things right, not just for him, but for herself. As they approached the estate, the towering iron gates came into view. They were slightly ajar, as if inviting them in, but Emily knew better than to trust appearances. James parked the car a safe distance away, pulling off the road and into the cover of the trees. The air was cool and still, the kind of quiet that made every sound seem amplified. They moved quickly and silently, their flashlights casting faint beams across the underbrush. The fence loomed ahead, and James led the way to a section where the metal had rusted, leaving a narrow gap. He crouched down, motioning for Emily to follow. She squeezed through, her breath catching as her jacket snagged briefly on the jagged edge. Once inside the property, the house came into view. It was massive, its dark silhouette standing out against the faint glow of the night sky. Vines crept up the stone walls, and many of the windows were boarded up, giving it an air of decay. But Emily knew better. This place wasn't abandoned. It was a fortress disguised as a ruin. James pulled out a small device, a tablet connected to the estate's security system. He tapped the screen, his brow furrowed in concentration. After a tense moment, he nodded. Cameras are offline. We have 10 minutes before the backup system kicks in." Emily followed him toward the house, her heart pounding. They reached a side door, which the investigator had identified as the least monitored entry point. James picked the lock with practiced precision, the faint click of the mechanism sounding impossibly loud in the stillness. The door creaked open, and they slipped inside. The interior of the house was even more unsettling than its exterior. Dust covered the furniture, and the air was heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. But beneath the surface, Emily could see signs of recent activity: scuffed floors, a partially burned candle on the mantel, and a faint impression in the dust on the dining table where something had been placed and recently removed. James motioned for her to follow, leading her through the darkened hallways toward the study on the second floor. According to the investigator's report, the safe was hidden behind a false panel in the wall. Emily's job was to find it. They entered the study, and Emily immediately set to work, her eyes scanning every inch of the room. The faint moonlight streaming through a cracked window illuminated rows of dusty bookshelves, a large wooden desk, and a faded rug. She ran her fingers along the edges of the walls, searching for any irregularities. "There," she whispered, pointing to a section of the paneling that seemed slightly out of alignment. James joined her, his hands finding a small latch hidden in the grooves of the wood. With a soft click, the panel slid open, revealing the steel door of a safe. James pulled a set of tools from his bag and began working on the lock. Emily stood guard by the door, her nerves on edge. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made her heart race. She glanced at her watch. The backup security system would activate in 3 minutes. "Hurry," she urged, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm almost there," James replied, his tone calm but focused. Finally, the safe door swung open. Inside were stacks of folders bound with rubber bands and several USB drives. James grabbed everything, stuffing the contents into his bag. Emily felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. Someone was coming. The sound of footsteps echoed closer, slow and deliberate, each step reverberating like a countdown to disaster. Emily's heart thundered in her chest as she exchanged a panicked glance with James. His hand hovered near the bag of evidence, his body tense and ready to act. The study, once a haven for planning and secrecy, now felt like a trap. Emily's mind raced. They had been so careful. How had they been discovered? She looked toward the window, considering whether they could escape through it, but the drop was too high. They were trapped. The footsteps stopped just outside the study door. The silence that followed was even worse. Emily held her breath, gripping the edge of the desk for support. The door creaked open, revealing the last person she wanted to see. Amanda Wilson stepped into the room, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. Her presence was as commanding as ever, but there was something more dangerous about her now. The polished veneer she wore so carefully in public had vanished, replaced by an expression of cold, calculating malice. She didn't look surprised to find them there. She looked amused. "Well," Amanda said, her voice smooth and laced with venom, "I have to admit, I didn't expect my little maid to show such initiative. I suppose I underestimated you, Emily." Emily said nothing, her throat too dry to form words. Amanda's eyes flicked to James, her smile widening. "And you, James. It's almost touching how predictable you are, always trying to play the hero even when you're completely out of your depth." James straightened, his jaw clenched. "This ends tonight, Amanda," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "We have everything we need to expose you." Amanda's laugh was sharp and bitter, cutting through the air like a blade. "Expose me? Oh, James, you really are naive. Do you think some files and USB drives will make a difference? My family has been cleaning up messes like this for generations. You're just another bump in the road." As she spoke, two figures emerged from the hallway behind her. They were Amanda's men, the same ones who had shadowed her movements at the hotel, large, imposing, and armed. One of them carried a gun, his finger resting casually on the trigger. Emily's stomach dropped. "You see," Amanda continued, gesturing to the men, "I don't leave loose ends. And unfortunately for you, you've both become very inconvenient." James shifted slightly, his hand inching toward the bag of evidence. Amanda noticed and shook her head, her expression darkening. "Don't even think about it," she warned. "Hand over the bag. Now." Emily felt paralyzed, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and defiance. Amanda's men were blocking the only exit, and the gun in the taller man's hand was a chilling reminder of how this could end. She glanced at James, who was clearly weighing their options. But then something shifted. Amanda's attention wavered for just a moment as she looked toward one of her men, issuing a low, curt order. It was enough for James to act. In one swift motion, he hurled the bag toward Emily and lunged at the nearest man, knocking him off balance. The commotion threw the room into chaos. Emily caught the bag, clutching it tightly as Amanda shouted for her men to regain control. The second man raised his gun, aiming it at James, but Emily reacted instinctively. She grabbed a heavy brass bookend from the desk and threw it with all her strength. The bookend struck the man's arm, causing him to drop the weapon with a clatter. James took advantage of the moment, delivering a sharp blow that sent the man sprawling. Amanda screamed in frustration, her composure unraveling as she backed toward the door. "Do something, you idiots!" she shrieked at her men, who were scrambling to recover. Emily's hands trembled as she looked at James. "We have to get out of here," she said, her voice urgent. James nodded, grabbing the bag from her and pulling her toward the door. The two men were still disoriented, and Amanda was too busy barking orders to stop them. They bolted down the hallway, their footsteps pounding against the floor as they made for the stairs. The house seemed to close in around them, every shadow a potential threat. As they reached the first floor, Emily glanced over her shoulder and saw Amanda giving chase, her face twisted with fury. "You won't get away with this," Amanda shouted, her voice echoing through the empty halls. James and Emily burst through the front door, the cool night air hitting them like a wave. The car was parked just beyond the fence, but the property felt endless as they sprinted toward it. Behind them, Amanda's men emerged from the house, their shouts mingling with the sound of heavy boots on gravel. "Go!" James yelled as they reached the gap in the fence. Emily slipped through first, her jacket snagging briefly on the rusted metal. James followed, tossing the bag ahead of him before scrambling to his feet. They made it to the car, just as one of Amanda's men raised his gun again. A shot rang out, the sound deafening in the still night. Emily ducked instinctively, her heart hammering as she threw herself into the passenger seat. James jumped into the driver's seat, starting the engine with shaking hands. The car roared to life, its tires kicking up dirt as they sped down the narrow road. The men gave chase for a few seconds before fading into the distance, their shouts drowned out by the hum of the engine. Emily clutched the bag tightly in her lap, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her mind raced with everything that had just happened. The confrontation, the escape, the danger that still loomed. She glanced at James, who was gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. "We have the evidence," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We did it." James nodded, but his expression remained grim. "It's not over yet," he said. "Not until Amanda pays for what she's done." Emily didn't respond. She stared out the window, the dark trees rushing past in a blur. Amanda had underestimated her, dismissed her as nothing more than a maid. But Emily had proven her wrong. For the first time in her life, she felt like she had reclaimed her power. But deep down, she knew James was right. This wasn't the end. Amanda wouldn't give up so easily. And Emily would have to stay strong for what was still to come. The ride back to the city was silent, except for the steady hum of the car's engine and the occasional ragged breath from Emily. Her hands were still trembling as she clutched the bag of evidence tightly against her chest. The reality of what they had just endured began to settle over her, the adrenaline fading and leaving a hollow ache in its wake. James's expression was unreadable, his jaw tight as he focused on the road ahead. Every so often, his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, checking for any sign that Amanda's men had followed. The darkness of the countryside stretched around them, the towering trees on either side of the road casting eerie shadows. They wouldn't feel safe until they reached the city, where they could finally hand over the evidence to Detective Martinez. When they crossed the city limits, the oppressive silence in the car lifted slightly. Emily loosened her grip on the bag, though she still held it close. James glanced at her briefly, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. Emily nodded, though the tightness in her chest told a different story. "I'm fine," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "Let's just get this over with." James nodded, his focus shifting back to the road. The city lights grew brighter as they neared the industrial district where they had arranged to meet Martinez. The detective had been their silent ally throughout the investigation, and now he would be the one to bring Amanda to justice. Emily clung to that thought as they pulled into the dimly lit parking lot of a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Martinez was already there, leaning against an unmarked police car with his arms crossed. He straightened when he saw them, his sharp eyes scanning their faces as they stepped out of the car. Emily handed him the bag without a word, her hands still trembling. Martinez opened it and rifled through the contents, nodding in approval as he examined the files and USB drives. "This is everything?" he asked, looking up at James. "It's everything," James confirmed. "Financial records, contracts, and evidence linking Amanda to at least 3 deaths, including Thomas Williams." Martinez's jaw tightened at the mention of Emily's father. He glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. "You did good, Emily," he said. "Your father would be proud." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat, but she forced herself to swallow it down. "I just want her to pay for what she's done," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. Martinez nodded. "She will. This is more than enough to bring her in." As if on cue, another unmarked car pulled into the lot, its headlights cutting through the dim light. 2 uniformed officers stepped out, their expressions serious as they approached Martinez. He handed them the bag and gave them quick instructions to secure the evidence at the precinct. With the files safely in police hands, Emily felt a flicker of relief. But it was fleeting. Amanda was still out there, and Emily knew the woman wouldn't go down without a fight. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The police moved swiftly, armed with the evidence that Emily and James had risked everything to obtain. Amanda's arrest made headlines, her carefully curated public image crumbling as the truth of her crimes came to light. reports of financial fraud, conspiracy, and even murder filled the news, painting a damning portrait of a woman who had built her empire on lies and blood. Emily watched the coverage with a mix of satisfaction and lingering fear. Amanda's face was plastered across every screen, but the cold confidence in her expression made Emily's stomach churn. Even in handcuffs, Amanda didn't look defeated. She looked like a predator biding her time. James stayed close to Emily throughout the ordeal, offering her a quiet strength that she hadn't realized she needed. Together, they attended meetings with Martinez, preparing for the trial that would bring Amanda to justice. Emily gave her statement, recounting everything she had seen and heard, every detail of Amanda's crimes that had been etched into her memory. The trial began 2 months later, drawing intense media attention. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, and onlookers eager to witness the downfall of a woman who had once been untouchable. Emily sat in the gallery, her hands clenched in her lap as the prosecution presented its case. Witness after witness took the stand, painting a picture of Amanda as a ruthless manipulator who had destroyed lives to protect her wealth and power. The evidence Emily and James had recovered was damning. Detailed records of fraudulent transactions, contracts signed under duress, and correspondence that tied Amanda directly to the deaths of her enemies. When it was Emily's turn to testify, she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She took a deep breath as she walked to the witness stand, her gaze briefly meeting Amanda's. The woman's cold, calculating stare sent a chill down her spine, but Emily refused to look away. She had come too far to back down now. She told the court everything. About her father's death, about overhearing Amanda's plan to kill James, and about their harrowing escape from the estate. Her voice wavered at times, but her resolve never faltered. When she finished, the courtroom was silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. The defense tried to discredit her, painting her as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, but Emily held her ground. She knew the truth, and now the world did too. The verdict came 3 weeks later. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in a flurry of activity as the judge read the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Amanda's expression remained stoic, but Emily saw the faintest flicker of defeat in her eyes as the guards led her away. It was over. As Emily stepped out of the courthouse, the weight she had carried for so long began to lift. The sun was bright overhead, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold, sterile walls of the courtroom. She took a deep breath, feeling the first stirrings of peace she had known in years. James was waiting for her on the steps, his expression one of quiet pride. "You did it," he said simply. "We did it," Emily corrected, a small smile tugging at her lips. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope, for justice, for a future, and for the life she had always deserved. The courthouse steps felt surreal as Emily walked down them, the cool stone beneath her shoes grounding her in the moment. The crowd of reporters and onlookers had thinned, and the once buzzing atmosphere of anticipation had faded into a quieter hum. Amanda was gone. Taken away in handcuffs, her legacy of cruelty and deception shattered. The weight Emily had carried for so long, the burden of her father's death, the fear of Amanda's threats was finally beginning to lift. James walked beside her, his presence a quiet reassurance. He had been a steadfast ally throughout the chaos, and now, as they reached the edge of the courthouse steps, he turned to her with a small, proud smile. "You can breathe now, Emily," he said softly. "It's over." Emily nodded, but the enormity of the moment kept her silent. She had spent years living in the shadow of her father's death, quietly enduring the injustices of a world that seemed designed to keep her down. Now, she stood on the other side of that shadow, free to step into the light. But freedom was unfamiliar, and the future stretched before her like an uncharted map. "Do you need a ride home?" James asked, breaking the silence. Emily shook her head. "I think I'll walk," she said. "I need some time to think." James nodded in understanding. "Take care of yourself, Emily. And remember, if you ever need anything, I'm here." She smiled faintly. "Thank you, James, for everything." As he walked away, Emily turned and began her journey home. The streets of New York seemed different now, the familiar noise and chaos tinged with a strange sense of possibility. The city was the same, but Emily wasn't. She had faced her fears, fought for justice, and won. The invisible maid who had once blended into the background was gone. In her place was a woman who had taken back her voice, her power, and her life. Emily moved out of her apartment the following week. The small, cramped space that had been her sanctuary during her darkest days no longer felt like home. With the financial settlement from Amanda's frozen assets, a portion of which had been allocated to Emily as restitution for her father's wrongful death, she was able to secure a modest but comfortable place in a quieter neighborhood. The new apartment was nothing extravagant, but it was hers. For the first time in her life, Emily felt a sense of ownership over her surroundings. She decorated it with care, filling the space with warm, earthy tones and small touches that reminded her of her father. A framed photograph of the two of them on her nightstand, a small potted plant that she hoped to keep alive, and a set of his old tools she had salvaged from storage. Every morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows, Emily took a moment to appreciate the quiet. It was a far cry from the chaos of her old life, but she welcomed the stillness. It gave her time to think about what came next. The idea came to her one evening as she sat on her small balcony, watching the sun set over the city. She had spent so much of her life feeling powerless, trapped in a system that seemed designed to erase people like her. But now, with the resources and knowledge she had gained, she realized she had the ability to help others. Emily decided to start a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting women of color in service industries, women who face the same discrimination and exploitation she had endured for years. The organization would provide resources, legal aid, and educational opportunities, giving these women the tools they needed to break free from the cycles of poverty and invisibility. The work was challenging, but it gave Emily a sense of purpose. She threw herself into the project, connecting with local activists, lawyers, and community leaders who shared her vision. Slowly but surely, the organization began to take shape. It wasn't long before Emily's small office, located in a modest shared workspace, was buzzing with activity. Women began reaching out, sharing their stories of resilience and hardship. Some were housekeepers, like Emily had been. Others worked as nannies, servers, or factory workers. Each story was unique, but they all shared common threads of strength and perseverance. Emily listened to each woman with care, offering whatever support she could. One day, as she reviewed applications for a scholarship program her organization had launched, Emily received a letter in the mail. The envelope was plain, with no return address, but when she opened it, she found a single piece of paper inside. It was a handwritten note. "Thank you for standing up. People like you change the world." The message was simple, but it brought tears to Emily's eyes. For so long, she had felt unseen, her voice lost in a sea of privilege and prejudice. Now, she was part of something bigger, a movement that gave people like her the courage to speak, to fight, and to dream. Months turned into a year, and the nonprofit grew beyond anything Emily had imagined. She hired a small team to help manage the workload, including Maria, one of her former co-workers from the hotel. Maria had been hesitant at first, unsure if she could leave the security of her job, but Emily had convinced her that they were building something important, something that could change lives. One evening, as the office was winding down for the day, Maria approached Emily with a hesitant smile. "You know," she said, "I never thought I'd see the day when someone like us could make this kind of difference." Emily smiled back, her heart swelling with pride. "It's just the beginning," she said. "There's still so much work to do." Emily's life wasn't perfect. She still carried the scars of her past, and there were moments when the weight of her responsibilities felt overwhelming. But she had found something she hadn't known she was searching for, a sense of purpose, a community, and a future she could shape with her own hands. As she stood on the balcony of her apartment one evening, the city lights twinkling below, Emily allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought of her father and the lessons he had taught her about courage and integrity. She thought of James and the partnership that had helped bring Amanda to justice. And she thought of all the women she had met through her work, each of them a testament to the power of resilience. The world wasn't perfect, but it was changing. And so was Emily. She was no longer invisible. She was a force to be reckoned with, a voice for those who had been silenced, and a woman who had reclaimed her power. For the first time in her life, Emily felt free, and she knew, deep in her heart, that her story was just beginning. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on more content. Check out our other videos for more incredible stories, and feel free to share this video with friends who would love it too. See you in the next one.